To the world, The Sound of Music was pure joy, wholesome, sweeping, unforgettable. But to Christopher Plummer, it was something else entirely. He rarely talked about it. When asked, he smiled, gave a polite answer, and moved on. But beneath the civility was something sharper. Because for decades, Plummer resented the very role that made him a star. Not because it was a failure, but because it defined him in a way that felt hollow. And what he finally admitted at 91, just before he died, turned everything fans believed upside down. Christopher Plummer was never meant to be a movie star, at least not in the Hollywood sense. He was a stage actor, Shakespeare-trained, fiercely exacting, obsessed with craft. In his mind, great acting came from struggle, from digging into a character's flaws. He didn't play heroes, he played people. So when The Sound of Music came along in 1964, it wasn't his dream role, it was a job. He assumed it would be a pleasant musical, a commercial success that would come and go. He had no idea it would become one of the most beloved films of all time, or that it would cling to him for the rest of his life. At first, he played along. He stood beside Julie Andrews in press photos. He smiled at premieres. He answered the same questions again and again. And for a while, he kept his opinion to himself. But inside, something was building. He later confessed that, even during production, he felt like a tourist in his own performance. He didn't dislike the cast. He admired Andrews deeply. But the role itself, the stern, wounded Captain von Trapp, had been rewritten into something simpler, softer, and, in his view, less human. He tried to shape the performance. He asked for darker moments, for silence that meant something, for the grief of a widower to come through. But as the script evolved, those layers were sanded down. The captain became a symbol, not a man. And Plummer could feel himself disappearing inside the uniform. He didn't lash out. He didn't storm off set. That wasn't his style. But when he spoke about the film later, the sarcasm bled through. He called it The Sound of Mucus more than once, not just to be clever, but to make a point. To him, the film's sweetness had come at the cost of truth. Still, the world loved it, and they loved him in it. And that's what stung the most. Because no matter what he did afterward, no matter how many kings he played, how many awards he won, or how many stages he conquered, he was always asked about The Sound of Music. Never about Hamlet, never about Barrymore, always the captain. In Salzburg, during production, he began disappearing between scenes. He'd walk the streets alone, a copy of Richard III tucked in his coat pocket. Locals would spot him by the river, pacing, reciting lines under his breath. He wasn't rehearsing for anything in particular. He was reminding himself who he was. He once said that if he died, the first line of his obituary would be about The Sound of Music. Not about a career that spanned 6 decades. Not about his Tony, his Emmy, or his Oscar. Just that one film. And he wasn't entirely wrong. To fans, Captain von Trapp was a career-defining triumph. But to Plummer, it was something far more complicated. It was the moment his face became famous, but his work felt invisible. And for decades, he carried that quiet resentment, until the moment it finally broke through. For years, people assumed Christopher Plummer's distaste for The Sound of Music came down to snobbery. That he was a stage actor who simply couldn't stand musicals. That he resented joy or simplicity or anything that looked like happiness on screen. But that wasn't the truth. Plummer didn't hate musicals. He loved music. He respected well-crafted sentiment. He admired his co-stars. What he hated quietly, deeply, was the feeling of being erased. When he took the role of Captain von Trapp, the character was written with weight. A grieving widower, a military man suppressing his emotion. Someone whose rigidity was a shield against loss. That's what drew Plummer in. He saw a man cracking under the surface, a man trying not to drown. But as filming went on, that man disappeared. The character was softened, rewritten, streamlined into a figure of order-turned romantic partner. The grief was minimized. The trauma vanished. What remained was charming and safe, designed for audiences to love, not understand. And Plummer felt that loss. He tried to push back, asked for scenes to be restored, offered subtle ways to preserve the emotional arc. But it was clear, the final product was going in a different direction. It wasn't personal. It was business. The studio wanted warmth, comfort, family, not complexity. He later said, the role had been reduced to a cardboard figure, and it haunted him because he had brought more to it, or tried to. When the film was released, the world exploded with love, and Plummer disappeared into the background. No one asked what had been cut. No one asked what he saw in the character. They asked about the costumes, the location, whether he really sang Edelweiss. He didn't. The song had been dubbed, but no one cared about that either. The film made him famous, but not in the way he wanted. Not for his control or his nuance or his process, but for being handsome, for looking strict, for standing beside Julie Andrews and smiling in a tux. And that smile became a mask. Behind it was someone furious, not at others, but at himself. Because he had said yes. He had accepted the job. He had gone along with the rewrites. He had played the captain, even when the version they wanted didn't match the one he believed in. There's one moment he recalled that never left him. Years after the film's release, he was backstage at a theater in Toronto. A fan came up, kind, eager, starstruck, and handed him a framed still from the film. It showed Plummer mid-song, eyes soft, holding Julie Andrews as they danced in the garden. The fan said, "This is the most beautiful moment in cinema history." Plummer paused, took the photo, and said quietly, "I wish I remembered feeling that way when we filmed it." It wasn't anger, it was regret, a disconnect between what the world adored and what he experienced. Because for him, the sound of music wasn't joyful. It was frustrating. It was limiting. It was a reminder of everything that had been taken out of the role and everything he couldn't put back in. And while the film had opened every door, it left one door closed that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to unlock. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, the sound of music never left Christopher Plummer's life. It followed him into dressing rooms, crept into interviews, appeared in every introduction he was ever given. He might be performing Shakespeare in Stratford or receiving a Tony in New York, but the questions would always circle back to Salzburg. And to Plummer, that was its own kind of isolation. He wasn't ungrateful. He knew the film had given him global recognition. He knew families watched it every Christmas, that it had become sacred to generations. But for him, the experience came with a price, the erasure of everything else he had built. It wasn't just a role that stuck. It was a shadow that refused to move. He'd done dozens of stage roles by the time he filmed The Sound of Music. King Lear, Hamlet, Cyrano, all complex men with fractured hearts. But none of those roles earned him the headlines. None of them followed him through airports. It was always the captain, always the man in the crisp uniform, softened by love, redeemed by song. Plummer later admitted that it made him feel like a ghost inside his own career. The world saw a performance frozen in time, but he kept evolving and no one seemed to notice. He distanced himself from the cast after the film's release, not out of bitterness, but self-preservation. While Julie Andrews leaned into the legacy, Plummer pulled away. He turned down reunions, declined retrospectives, skipped anniversary specials. He wasn't angry at his co-stars. He just couldn't relive it the way they did. On stage, he still chased roles that terrified him. In interviews, he shifted conversations toward the projects that challenged him. But inevitably, someone would bring it up. The hills, the songs, the moment he softened during Edelweiss. And every time, Plummer would smile, politely, briefly, and move on. But inside, it hurt. There's a story he told years later, about a fan who waited for him backstage after a performance of Barrymore. The man was teary-eyed, overwhelmed, not by the play he had just seen, but by the chance to meet the captain. He handed Plummer a vinyl copy of the soundtrack and asked for a signature. Then he said, "I watched you with my mother every year. You were the father I never had." Plummer signed it. He thanked him, and then, once the man had gone, he sat quietly in his dressing room for almost half an hour, silent, staring at the floor. He once said, "The film means so much more to other people than it ever meant to me." That wasn't an insult. It was the truth. Because while The Sound of Music gave people comfort, it gave him a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw in it. A performance he didn't recognize. A legacy he didn't choose. And yet, he never quite let it go. Even in private, those closest to him said the film would come up, softly, unexpectedly. A reference here, a line there, as if he were testing the edges of something that still didn't sit right. Because being remembered isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's a burden. Captain von Trapp had made him famous. But he had also made Plummer feel like an actor who got stuck. Right at the moment the world decided who he was. And then, in his final years, something changed. The bitterness softened. The silence cracked. And Plummer finally said the words fans never expected to hear. By the time Christopher Plummer turned 80, the shadow of The Sound of Music hadn't disappeared, but it had grown quieter. He was older now, slower perhaps, but sharper than ever. And something in him had started to shift. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was distance. Maybe it was the realization that no amount of resistance could change what the film had meant to others. But quietly, without spectacle, Plummer began to let it back in. He didn't rush to embrace it. There were no sudden tributes or teary-eyed reunions. But for the first time in decades, he spoke of the film with something closer to grace. He credited Julie Andrews always. He called her a light. He acknowledged the children in the cast, the kindness of the crew, the beauty of the Austrian landscape. And slowly, his comments about the film grew more balanced. Not warm exactly, but less dismissive, less burdened. He never took back what he'd said before. He still believed the role had been flattened, that the film had robbed him of a deeper performance. But he could now admit that The Sound of Music had also done something extraordinary. It had endured. Families still watched it together. Children still sang the songs. People still came up to him with trembling hands and gratitude in their voices. And maybe Plummer began to realize that mattered too. In one of his final interviews, he was asked, yet again, about the film. The journalist braced for the usual sarcasm, the eye roll, the shrug. But Plummer paused, smiled faintly, and said, "It's not my favorite film, but it's the one people remember. And that's not nothing." It was the closest he ever came to reconciliation. And it wasn't just words. He showed up too. For the 50th anniversary of the film, Plummer made an appearance at a tribute event. He stood beside Julie Andrews, older now, his hair silver, his posture still regal. They laughed. They shared stories. And when asked what he thought of the film today, he answered with a surprising calm, "I respect what it became, and I'm proud to have been a part of something that brought people joy." That wasn't how he had always felt. But time had done its work. And yet, even in that softening, he never fully surrendered to the nostalgia. When he won the Oscar for Beginners in 2012, becoming the oldest actor in history to take home the award, he made no mention of The Sound of Music in his speech. No reference, no callback. It was his moment, his career, his craft. And for once, the world saw him as he wanted to be seen. That night, backstage, a reporter asked if he felt the captain had brought him to this moment. He shook his head gently and said, "No, this one I built myself." That was the line. Not bitter, just honest. Because for all the warmth that returned in his final years, for all the smiles, the nods, the grace, there was still a boundary between the man and the myth. He never disowned the film, but he never let it claim all of him either. He had spent decades trapped inside one image. And as he neared the end, he wanted something more lasting than fame. He wanted to be remembered not just for the role he inherited, but for the work he chose. And in those final years, he finally got it. But there was still one moment left, one decision made quietly behind the scenes, that told the world exactly how Plummer felt about the film that refused to let him go. And that moment said more than any interview ever could. Christopher Plummer was never afraid of final acts. In his later years, as many actors faded into retirement, he accelerated. He took on roles that challenged him, stories that stretched him, characters that allowed him to say the things he had waited a lifetime to express. And in doing so, he rewrote his ending. After winning his Oscar at 82, Plummer entered a rare phase of his career, one defined not by frustration or resentment, but by clarity. He no longer chased recognition. He didn't need to. He had survived the one thing many actors never do: being typecast by success. For decades, The Sound of Music had been a role he couldn't outpace. But now, in this new chapter, it no longer defined him. He had reclaimed the narrative, not with anger, but with consistency. He had shown the world what he was capable of. And quietly, the world had taken notice. But it was something else, a decision made near the very end, that revealed just how far Plummer had come. In the final months of his life, as he reviewed old interviews and unfinished correspondence, he reportedly came across a letter from a fan. It wasn't a typical fan letter. It didn't gush or beg for an autograph. It simply told a story. A woman had lost her father as a child. Every Christmas, her mother played The Sound of Music in their living room because it reminded her of him. The captain, she wrote, was distant at first, but eventually softened, just like her own father had. Watching the film became their ritual, and every time she saw Plummer on screen, she felt closer to the man she'd lost. Plummer read it twice, then set it down, and for a long time he didn't say a word. Later, when asked in a private conversation how he wanted to be remembered, he paused, then said, "Not just for what I wanted, but for what others saw in me, even when I didn't see it myself." It was the closest he ever came to surrendering to the legacy he had resisted. And then came the moment no one expected. When planning his memorial wishes with family, Plummer made a request that Edelweiss, the song he hadn't even sung himself in the film, be played softly at the gathering. No introduction, no explanation, just the melody. It was a gesture so quiet, so specific, that only those who truly knew him would understand. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It was something deeper: acceptance. A way of letting the song and everything it represented have its place without letting it take over the room. In that choice, Plummer spoke volumes. Not on camera, not in an interview, but in silence. He wasn't Captain von Trapp. He never had been. But he finally acknowledged that, for millions, the character had meant something real. And in his final act, he gave that meaning a space to breathe. It didn't erase the past. It didn't change the compromises. But it closed the story, because Christopher Plummer didn't hate The Sound of Music in the end. He just never felt seen by it. And maybe that's what hurt the most, that the performance people loved the most was the one he felt least connected to. But in his own time, on his own terms, he let it go. He gave it a place in his story, just not the whole story. And in doing so, he finally became what he'd always wanted to be. Not the captain the world remembered, but the artist he knew he was all along. Christopher Plummer spent over 70 years telling stories. Some were grand, some intimate, some beloved by millions, and others seen by only a few. He played kings, killers, scholars, and lovers. But the one role that followed him longest was the one he didn't ask to keep. For decades, he pushed against the legacy of The Sound of Music. Not because it was bad, but because it was incomplete. He hadn't been allowed to give the performance he imagined. And what remained felt like a version of himself the world misunderstood. But legacy has a way of softening with time. In his final years, Plummer didn't rewrite the past, but he made peace with it. He honored what the film meant to others. He allowed space for its beauty, even as he remembered its limitations. And with one quiet decision, to let Edelweiss play at his memorial, he spoke the final word on a story that had followed him for more than half a century. Not with bitterness, not with pride, but with grace. Because in the end, Christopher Plummer gave the world something rare. The truth, even when it was uncomfortable, and the courage to let it go. For more emotional stories, check out this video.